Hey guys, I asked y'all a question yesterday, just seeing what was on people's hearts and minds going into this week, and I got so many responses, mainly a lot about cheesecake, which if you checked my story, you kind of know maybe a little bit of what that's about. But I'm not going to answer questions about cheesecake. One of the biggest questions I actually got was, how do you integrate spirituality into daily life? What a question. I think if we're going to try to really go about answering any kind of question in the spiritual space, we really need to be careful about how we define the words that we're using. And it's more important in the spiritual space than it is in the physical or material space, because the spiritual space is much more easy to be misunderstood. It's one thing for me to talk about the table behind this camera or the window to my right, because there's sensory, material things that can be experienced. But when we're talking about things like spirituality and meditation and God and self-realization, there's so much room for a lack of clarity. And when there's a lack of clarity over something, particularly something spiritual, it's a barrier to actually experiencing it. And I see that so much in this space. So many people throw around words like awakening and love and God and self-realization and all of these beautiful terms and words that have been used in religions and more modern spirituality, but everyone has their own definition of these things. How many people out there have the exact same definition of what they mean when they say awakening? I think for me, being in the space, in pressing people in the terms, most people can't even stop and define what awakening actually means. And so many people are using the term. So if we're going to talk about how to integrate spirituality into daily life, we have to start by defining spirituality. What actually is spirituality? To me, spirituality is exactly what it says it is. It is the difference between the physical, the material, and the formless. It is the difference between who I am today, the version of me that you're seeing on this screen, and it is the actual conscious presence and the conscious life that is within me and the conscious life that is the same that's inside of you. It's the life that's the same in a pine needle that's on the tree. As the pine needle falls to the ground, it becomes a sprout, it takes root, it becomes a baby pine, and then it becomes a towering pine tree. Nothing in that physical progression is the same. It's always changing, but it's carrying the same intelligence within all of the different phases of its physical expression. That intelligence that it's carrying is spiritual. That intelligence is spiritual because it's formless. It can appear in any physical form. It can appear in the pine needle. It can appear in the sprout. It can appear in the baby pine tree. And it can appear in the towering pine tree that goes over my apartment building and you can see from downtown. So that which is spiritual is that inner life that's in all of us, and that is really in all beings and all life forms, that is accessible, but not in the physical dimension. Not by turning and only having eyes that see the physical manifestation of things, that only have eyes that see what our senses can pick up. It's a more intuitive way of living. The spiritual life is very intuitive, and we can experience it directly through meditation and through different paths of yoga, but it starts with an intuition that really, at the end of the day, there's more to me than just a sack of meat. So how do we actually start integrating spiritual awareness into our daily life so that we're living from it and growing in it and experiencing more of it for ourselves, but also embodying it in a way that we're able to relate from it? We're able to actually give it to others. The first thing we have to recognize that we can't do is remove ourselves from the world. I mean, you could, if you want to live in the Himalayas or somewhere, or a monastery. You can remove yourself from sensory experience. You can remove yourself from daily life and thus attain to a spiritual reality. But I think most of us, if we're scrolling through on Instagram and we're watching this right now, or we asked one of these questions, we're not interested in living in a monastery. So removing ourselves from physical life isn't an option to increase spiritual awareness. So how can we increase spiritual awareness while still out in the world? We can't distance ourselves from physical life, but we can distance ourselves from our own reactions to physical life. We can begin creating space between us and our narratives, between us and our anxieties, between us and our beliefs and reactions and biases and judgments. Because at the end of the day, that's what you're going to go to a monastery or into a cave in the Himalayas for anyway. Adyashanti actually says that spiritual life is no longer relating to your own mental narratives as meaningful or compelling. How do we start to no longer relate to our own mental narratives as meaningful or compelling? We start to create a little space between us and them. That space can be as small as a half second. That space can be you're out in the market, you're in a long line, you're talking to your boss or whoever, and you feel a particular habitual sensory experience well up in you, anxiety, anger, a harsh judgment, and you pause, half second, and you don't feed into that reaction. This is a very small step, just creating very half-second gaps in our reaction to sensory experience that allows us to deepen more and more into spiritual embodiment. Half-second gaps won't seem like much at first, but after a few weeks of doing that, the half second turns into a second, and a second into 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds. There are other ways to implement this space between us and our reactions. I talk a lot about another method. Whenever you become aware, take a deep breath, drop all resistance, and for 3 to 5 seconds, completely, radically renounce the world. Radically don't identify with anything. Just be. Just be presence. Just be present. That would be a more tangible, sensory way to say it. Rather than emptying the world or renouncing the world or handing the world over to God or the universe, just be present. But it's really important to point more directly at it. For 3 to 5 seconds, renounce the world. Renounce your stories, your biases, your identifications, your roles, your reactions. Radically renounce the world whenever you become aware, whenever it feels natural. If you do that, and if you're devoted to creating short little gaps between you and your thinking, naturally more and more spiritual awareness enters your life. Because what's left? When you're not constantly relating to the part of you that is relating to the physical world, naturally the centeredness of spiritual awareness becomes what your mind and your moods and your whole experience start to gravitate around. So the two methods, one, creating a half-second gap between you and your reaction, that increases and leads to a more integrated spiritual embodiment. You're no longer wrapped up in the world and in your response to the world. And then whenever it feels natural and you become aware, for 3 to 5 seconds, radically renounce the world. Rest in the emptiness that's left. Those are just two powerful ways. Thank you to everyone that reached out and responded to my story and asking these questions yesterday. I got some super powerful questions in addition to the cheesecake questions. I might make some videos talking about those in the future. If I don't, it is my intention to respond to each of you guys. I always appreciate all of the messages and all of the interaction, and I want to be of more and more service to you guys as much as I can be. Thank you for making yourselves available and for showing up. Thank you guys.